think I just hurt my wrist holding up all the books for my previous video's thumbnail. But yeah, anyway, hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today I want to talk to you about the worst books that I read in 2020. If you want to check out any of the previous videos that I have done in my 2020 wrap-up series, which are my stats and looking back at my goals, my most disappointing as well as my most surprising books of 2020, I did collect a playlist. I collected them within a playlist, and I will leave the playlist link down below and up there, so go and check it out if you haven't yet. But yeah, today we're going to talk about all the worst books, and because this is the internet and people love being butthurt about it, just a little disclaimer, I don't hate you if you love any of these books. Your opinions are absolutely valid, but these are mine and I thought these books were shit. So that's what we're gonna talk about today. So let's get into it. Compared to my most disappointing and most surprising books lists, these books are in kind of an order. They're not in a definitive order, but the books I'm gonna talk about earlier I liked a little bit more and I thought were less bad than the books that I'm gonna talk about later in the video. So yeah, let's start with a book where I can technically see why people love it. However, it kind of infuriated me, and that book was Sandlin Essence by Josiah Bancroft, which is the first book in the Books of Babel series. Or Babel? Babel? I don't know. Anyway, in this book we follow Thomas Sandlin, who is on his honeymoon with his young wife. And for their honeymoon they went to this kind of marvel of humankind in this world, which is the Tower of Babel. And it's kind of like this steampunk style fantasy contraption tower thing where you have different levels and every level is something different and like its own little world in a way. However, Thomas Sandlin, he loses his wife on the very first day, minutes after they arrived at the tower. And so you follow Sandlin as he ascends through the levels of the tower, hence the title Sandlin Ascends, and goes looking for his wife. And well, I really didn't like this book. I am not against picking up the second book at least, because, you know, the concept was interesting and Sandlin was a fantasy character that isn't your typical fantasy character, because he's a headmaster at a school actually, so he's kind of this really insecure little man. But I also didn't like, you know, the whole storyline of a man going after his damsel in distress. And I have heard that apparently that's not what the story is about, and that's just because the first book is from the point of view of Sandlin, obviously. But yeah, I just, you know, I loved what we got to see of the character of his wife, and I would have absolutely loved the book if we had some POVs of her point of view. But yeah, I'm just over the male narrative in fantasy, I gotta be honest. And this is why I actually, even though it was a really easy and quick read and there were elements that I appreciated in this book, I ended up giving this book 2 stars only, and it's on my worst books of 2020 list. Next I have a book that isn't so much bad as it is just ungood, like really ungood. But this book just made me feel absolutely nothing, and I feel like there's not even enough there for me to think this book is bad, which is just a really weird feeling to have. But that book is To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini, which, you know, is his first publication in like 10 years or something. And yeah, this one was, it was ungood. It wasn't even bad. But before we get into all the problems I had with this book, let's first talk about what this is about. This is a space opera following this young woman who finds alien life on this planet as she kind of checks it out to see if it's possible to, you know, grow stuff there. And this alien life just kind of latches onto her and becomes this type of bodysuit. And from that point onward, she's kind of in the middle of this kind of, you know, first contact with aliens conflict style thing. And yeah, but okay, the main thing why it's bad is like alien vagina. just, I don't know how else to describe this. But yeah, the alien is a bodysuit, and there's a scene where she tries to like look if the alien is also covering her vagina, which is weird. Like, it's really weird. And then there's also a scene where she gets her period for the first time, because so far it has been like scientifically repressed, and her period and period cramps are described in a way that I have never heard anyone who gets their period describe their period. Like, it was, I wasn't sure what it's supposed to be for the longest time, but I had this trepidation, is that the right word? Like, I was scared that the period, or that being a period, was what Christopher Paolini was attempting to describe, but it just, man, it was so off. It was so off. Like, didn't you have any better readers that were people who got their period? No one at all told you that, like, oh my god. And yeah, also something like, kudos to him to being a man who describes a woman getting her period, but then afterwards it's never like mentioned again in the continuing few days of her that she still has her period. But anyway, that's that. Then continuing on, the plot just felt like it was non-consistent. I did not care at all. I also didn't care about any of the characters. I didn't even dislike the characters. They were just so bland, and I didn't care about them at all. And I didn't care about the main character. And this book was just like the most boring book I read within 2020. But the good thing I can say about it is that it's about 850 pages, and I finished it in like 9 days. So I read about 100 pages a day of this book, which was really easy because there was just nothing happening. And then I kept on skim reading because it was just such a fast read. It was amazing. But yeah, that's the second book on my worst books list. Next, I have The Dying of the Light by George R.R. Martin, and this is just, I don't even remember what this is about. Ah, right. This is about this man who gets this SOS message from his ex-girlfriend, and so he doesn't know what's going on, but he goes to meet her, and it turns out that she isn't in any trouble at all, and he still thinks she's in trouble, and she just pretends like she isn't in trouble. And then there's some cultural stuff talked about within this book that I wasn't okay with, because basically, I mean, on the one hand there were interesting conversations on like judging cultures that aren't your own by the morals of your culture and whether or not that's okay or not, and it seemed within this conversation to generally be along the lines of, you know, don't judge other cultures by your moral standards. But then the culture that was said about was a culture that basically hunts humans for fun and commits genocide and stuff, which, you know, there were some mixed signals there. And then the other reasons why I didn't like this was, first of all, because it was really obvious that George R. Martin at this time wasn't the level of writer he is now or was during Game of Thrones. And then also, again, damsel in distress storyline, which I am not a fan of. And like, George R. Martin made an attempt to have the woman, the damsel, be self-actualized and stuff, but yeah, the attempt wasn't good enough. Next, let's talk about a book in a series where one of the books in that series was actually also on my most surprising books of 2020 list. And that book is The Dragon Republic, which is the second book in the Poppy War series by R.F. Kuang. This series is a Chinese history-inspired high fantasy, and we follow Rin, who is a war orphan who gets like accepted into this very prestigious military academy, and we follow her as she goes through the academy, as she graduates, as some wars start. And yeah, I enjoyed this one more than the first book, which was the Poppy War. However, overall, I just found the pacing to be very much all over the place. I found it to have like interesting concepts, but I found the execution of the concepts lacking a lot. And overall, just Rin really infuriated me as a character, but not in a way where I then enjoyed still following her, but in a way where that just really ruined my reading experience. Which, by the way, she's still effectively the same character in the third book, which was on my most surprising books of 2020 series. But the framing around Rin changes a lot, which then made it suddenly very interesting for me to follow Rin instead of just, you know, being along for the ride and being just constantly annoyed by her. And so yeah, I just didn't enjoy this book. I found it very boring and very tedious to get through. I actually have an entire spoiler-free review as well as also a spoiler-filled discussion of this book on my channel. So I will leave both of those videos linked down below and up there if you're interested on my more specific thoughts on this book. Then you can go and check those videos out. Next is a book that isn't necessarily bad because the story itself is bad, but because it's the worst sequel I have probably ever read. And that is A Heart So Fierce and Broken by Bridget Camera, which is the sequel to A Curse So Dark and Lonely and the second book in the Cursebreaker series. And the story itself was interesting enough. I mean, I wasn't really interested in the new characters that much, so I guess that took away from my reading experience. But the main thing that infuriated me so much about this book is that while the story itself was pretty interesting and pretty easy to follow, the characters just acted nothing like they were set up within the first book. And the way the story could happen was basically only because all of the characters acted completely differently to how they would act if they were still the characters that we like left in the first book. And yeah, that was just something where I was like, why though? Why? This has nothing to do anymore with the first book. The first book should have just stayed a standalone, and that's that. That's my opinion on this. I will read the third book when it comes out at the end of January. I'm like kind of curious to see what I will think of the ending of the series, if I can still warm up to the series as a whole. But yeah, this book was just the worst sequel I have ever read. It just was like so far removed from the first book. I cannot. Next, I have an entire series that is on this list, and that is the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski, at least the main storyline of The Witcher, which is from book 3 to book 7. Yeah, it's 5 books. And yeah, I don't know why I put myself through finishing this series. I mean, I'm kind of happy that I finished it, but it was just not worth the read. If you want to pick up The Witcher, read the first book, read The Last Wish, read like the short story collections, but do not go into the main series. This series follows Geralt of Rivia, who is a witcher, obviously. And what witchers are is they are professional monster hunters, basically. They are humans that have been mutated to be better able to hunt monsters, and now that is what they do for money. Now, Geralt's destiny has been connected to that of a child named Ciri, who is the child of the Elder Blood, which is this big deal within this world, and we find out why exactly it's such a big deal and so on. But I gotta say, overall, aside from the worst thing, which was the ending, like the last 2 to 3 books in the series, like the second half of the series basically, was definitely worse than the first half because the ending was just a non-ending. It basically just fizzled out. There was no big climax or anything, which, oh my god, was so annoying. Then also exactly what it means that Ciri is the child of the Elder Blood was misogynistic bullshit, which I also wasn't happy with, because can we please stop within fantasy to, you know, excuse violence and abuse towards women by it being grimdark? I just really don't want that anymore. But the main thing why this series just absolutely wasn't enjoyable for me from the first book onwards is that the writing, not the writing style, but the way the story is told is just so like nonsensical, because there's no climaxes within the books. Half of the story isn't even told from the main character's perspective, but from the perspective of characters that we just see in that one chapter and then never again, by characters that are like the spy masters of kings that like got some news from some spies of theirs, and so we're told the story kind of through a like the third person who has told the story, and it just, you know, it just was so annoying and absolutely made the reading experience like horrible. Absolutely horrible. I actually also have an entire spoiler-free series review on the series, so if you wanna know all my thoughts and why I hated the series, go and check this out down below and up there. Now we have 2 books left to talk about in my worst of 2020 series, and the first of those is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and this is a kind of gothic horror thriller type book that is set in the 1950s in Mexico. And we follow Noemi, who gets a letter from her cousin who is newlywed, and the cousin is sick and asks Noemi to come to her home. And she lives in this kind of like old Western style house, and there's some weird things going on there. So it's basically a haunted house type story. Now, the things I liked about this book, first of all, our main character Noemi is an anthropologist. I study cultural and social anthropology in my master's, so that's a plus for me. And then the second thing is that I did quite enjoy the building of atmosphere. Of course, I cannot say if it was exceptionally well done or not within the book, because I don't really read horror or thriller novels. However, I would say that it's probably well done because I have also read Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia this year, and I also really enjoyed the way she built her atmosphere in that novel. So yeah, I would tip towards well done rather than just the usual within Gothic horror. But the reason why I basically didn't like this book is because if I read a horror or thriller novel, I kind of want there to be a build-up towards the end, and I don't want the twist to come out of nowhere. Like, I'd rather see the twist coming, or like see the build up towards the twist coming and then the twist happening, as long as it's not too obvious, rather than there being a twist that absolutely wasn't built up at all. And like, that was kind of a little bit the case within this book. I mean, you know, from the very beginning, basically one of the elements that's gonna play a part in the twist and that's gonna be part of like the horror or like what's going on at this house at the end, but that part was so obvious that it was like really obvious, and all the rest was kind of just like, you know, it came out of nowhere. And yeah, I just don't like that within my like books. Like, I don't like twists that just feel like they have to come out of nowhere, because the good thing about twists isn't that they surprise you, but the good thing about a twist should be that if you closely read a book and if you pay attention closely, then you should be able to see the twist coming. So yeah, that was something that I really didn't like. I also didn't like the abundance of sexual assault within this novel, which, you know, was just way too much and not necessary at all. And yeah, I just, overall, while I did enjoy the atmosphere in the first half of the book, I just absolutely did not enjoy the second half of the book and found it incredibly boring. And the last book, the definitively worst book of 2020, was The Winter Duke by Claire Eliza Bartlett. And this also belongs in one of those categories that I talked about in the most disappointing books of 2020 video, because this is a YA sapphic standalone high fantasy and it's so bad. But first, let's talk about what this book is about. This book follows Ekata, who is a young princess of this dukedom, and basically the only thing she wants to do is she wants to like turn 18 or something, and she wants to leave for university and turn her back on the dukedom and like never ever return again. However, shortly before her brother is supposed to be crowned duke, her entire family falls asleep and doesn't wake up anymore. And so it's up to Ekata, our main character, to take over the dukedom and to also marry her brother's fiance, who is like this kind of warrior princess something. But yeah, why did I hate this so much? Mainly the main character, because, you know, I get you didn't want this, But the only thing the main character does is whine and whine and whine about how she never wanted this, and whine and whine and whine about how nobody's helping her, but then she also doesn't let anyone help her, and whine and whine and whine about how all the ministers are against her, and how all the ministers kind of put rocks into her path, how she can't do anything. But then whenever the ministers talk to her, she's just like all small and is like, yeah, I guess she, whatever, she can't stand up to herself, for herself. And like, she never stands up for herself at all. And you know, I understand that that might be the case at the beginning, but it doesn't change at all throughout the entirety of the novel. Because she just stays as politically stupid at the very beginning as she is at the very end. And there's no development where she's like, okay, you know what, this situation sucks, I never wanted this, but I want to do it right, and teach me about politics, teach me what I should do, teach me what the best path is. No, she doesn't. She just refuses to learn about it because my brother's gonna wake up anyway, so I don't have to learn this. I don't have to make sure I do the best job possible while I'm the only one left. And as you can tell, this character infuriated me a lot. And I cannot even remember anything else from this story because this character was the worst character I ever read about, and she was horrible. I hated her. The romance, the chemistry was non-existent. It was so boring. I hated this book. I hated it a lot. I cannot with this book. But yeah, that was it. That was it for the worst books I read within 2020. And now only the best books, only the positive stuff is left. But before we get to that, if you have read any of the books that I have talked about just now, tell me your thoughts on them. Did you hate them as much as I did? Or did you actually really enjoy them? As I said, that's completely fine. I don't care. But, I mean, I do care. Tell me. But, you know, I don't care that you have a different opinion from me. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. All the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where I read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman per month, are also in the description box down below, so go and check those out as well. And I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!